Maya Rizvi is a quiet, practical woman from a small coastal town who married Adrian Vale, a billionaire whose life is framed by glass, marble, and power. When she arrives at his flagship hotel to celebrate an anniversary and is turned away at the front desk because she looks too ordinary, the humiliation exposes a chasm she has carried quietly for years. Between the private warmth of her life and the brittle, performative world Adrian inhabits. Adrian responds not with petty revenge, but with a surgical, public reckoning, an overnight unmasking of entitlement that forces the hotel's glittering guests and staff to confront what they've become. The tale traces Maya's transformation from invisible wife to the moral center of a movement that reforms a microcosm of wealth and power, while Adrian learns that true power is the courage to admit error and build something better. The story is cinematic, rooted in sensory detail and emotional truth, and explores themes of dignity, class, redemption, and the quiet, radical power of ordinary people. The Vale Grand rose from the river like a folded promise, glass panes gilded by sunrise, terraces stacked like a careful city of balconies, a bell tower that winked at planes. For months, the hotel's publicity shots had looped across screens and billboards. Sweeping lobbies, shot as if from angels' eyes, cocktails held at the lip of infinity, models laughing like practiced sunlight. Adrian Vale liked the way the world watched his holdings breathe. He liked the way the marble under his palms matched the marble in his imagination. Hard, polished, unflinching. Maya Rizvi stood on the sidewalk outside the main entrance and looked up at the building as if reading a stranger's face. The event that mattered most to her. 10 years of marriage, 10 ordinary rotations of the planet, had been swallowed by the hotel's shadow. She wore a linen dress, the color of old tea, and a scarf her mother had knitted years before in the small town where she'd been raised. Her hair was gathered in a loose knot. There was a hand-sewn stain at the hem where a child had once sneezed jam on her, and she smiled at it the way one smiles at the place where a well-loved blanket is worn thin. "Mrs. Vale?" the doorman asked, polite and professional. He hesitated a fraction, as if he heard a discordant note. The valet looked at her shoes, which were sensible and scuffed, and then at the limousine idling at the curb. The concierge, Marco Ruiz, recognized her immediately. Marco recognized almost everyone, but he was not on duty at the front that morning. The woman at the desk, Celeste Rowan, with a voice like brittle silk and a smile that did not reach her eyes, stepped forward. "Name?" Celeste asked, fingers already poised above the terminal, the line between kindness and procedure always blurred by a policy manual. "Maya Vale," she said, the hope in her voice small enough to fit inside a teacup. "Adrian sent me." He said he had a surprise. Celeste's lips tightened the way someone tightens the lid on something they have no intention of opening. "We'll have a strict policy on walk-ins for private events, Mrs. Vale. Reservations must be made 24 hours in advance. Are you registered under another name?" Maya hesitated. She had, in other rooms, been called Mrs. Vale. On paper she was. But the Vale that mattered to the world was Adrian. Adrian Vale, whose name opened airports and studios and boardrooms. "No," she said, "no other name." A ripple moved through the marble atrium. Voices like a surf. People looked up from their phones, from their champagne, measuring the moment for gossip. A child pressed a finger to the glass of a display case. A server slowed. Eyes, keen and hungry, narrowed toward the woman in the linen dress. "Madam," Celeste said, an edge now. "I'm sorry. If this is a private suite reserved for Mr. Vale, we'll need to confirm via his office. Guests without confirmation cannot be accommodated." Maya's chest tightened. In the small town where she had grown up, being denied a room at an inn would be a short story told with pity and a cup of tea. In the city, it felt like a public unmaking. She reached for the phone in her purse, thinking to call Adrian. but then realized phones were part of the machinery she'd tried, in a way, to live outside of. Adrian's calls came with strategies and schedules. She had imagined herself walking into the Vale Grand the way she had walked into every kitchen and garden Adrian and she had shared unannounced. A little messy, entirely known. "Please," she said in a smaller voice. "My husband." Celeste's smile widened into something practiced and fatalistic. "Mr. Vale receives 100 such surprises a day, madam. We ask that, for the privacy of our other guests, he follows protocol." The phrasing landed like a fist. Maya felt it in the thinness of her throat. Protocol. Privacy. Other guests. They whispered the truth she had been trying not to pronounce, that while she shared a marriage with one of the city's most photographed men, in his building she was an extra, a prop the cameras should not find too often. She stepped back, because nothing else in her body seemed to have an answer. On the pavement across the lane, an elderly couple in business suits and a woman with an artfully flawless contour watched with delight, as if witnessing a small, polished drama. The boy behind them, the sort who collected small humiliations like badges, laughed. Someone took out their phone. She turned and moved away from the doors, and the sound of her footsteps was the sound of someone pulling a sleeve through a hold awkward. Inevitable. She drifted toward the coffee shop on the corner, where the city made less of itself. There she sat, hands cupping a hot cup, and watched through the window as the Vale Grand handled its inside business as if nothing existed beyond its glass. The staff slid like shutters, polite, closed. Inside her, a quiet crater opened. It was not that she had expected an ovation, or that Adrian had commandeered the red carpet for her. She had simply wanted to be seen as herself, not as an accessory to a fortune, and not as a rumor. Adrian saw the footage within the hour. The Vale Group's security team had cameras in every vestibule. The building watched itself like a pet. From his home, an apartment that looked onto the same river the Vale Grand faced, he watched the woman who was his life retreat into the cafe. For a breathless moment he sat very still, as if imagining a small boat, one whose oars had been carefully removed. He had created hotels that remembered names better than they remembered dates, restaurants that folded city maps into meanness. He liked the way the world bent. But he had not created what he was watching. The listlessness on Maya's face that was not always visible to him through ceremonies and private dinners. He stood, a long animal, and did not think in headlines, he thought in small corrections. He called Marco Ruiz, loyal, meticulous Marco, who had been with Vale Hospitality since the first boutique hotel, before staff had business cards with titles so sleek they were mirrors. "Find her," Adrian said without preamble. Marco found her quickly enough. She looked like a woman who had decided to hide from spectacle and failed because the city's light did not allow hiding. He approached with the kind of reverence reserved for people who had been double booked and then saved. "Mrs. Vale?" he asked. Maya looked up at him and, for the first time that morning, allowed herself to let a familiar face in. Marco had a way of seeing the person behind the suit of the building. "Mr. Vale's office wants to apologize," Marco said, and the apology was more complicated than the words. "Mr. Vale is. He's coming himself, but he asked me to bring you a change of clothes and a private car and to ask, would you let him make it right?" She thought of the linen dress and the jam, stain, and the way waiting rooms felt to her, that they allowed the world to decide her value by the softness of her shoes. Yet Marco did not bring the theatricality so often deployed in houses of money. He brought, in his hand, the gentleness of someone who had once been called to fix a simple mistake and had watched how small kindness saved trust. She considered declining. She had been humiliated, yes, but she also felt a prouder courage. "I don't want a spectacle," she said, "and I don't want to make anyone lose their position." Marco listened with a face that held no news judgment. Mr. Vale does not want spectacle either. He wants you. He said that if you let him, he will not make a scene. He said he'd like to ask you for something. Not apologies. Something else. Adrian's arrival was quiet. He stepped out of the car without the armor of press or aides. Up close, he looked untouched by whatever the world told of him. Older, gentled by time. When he saw Maya, he did not move in the way rich men often did to show ownership. He came like a man seeking refuge. Maya, he said, and his voice held a million small apologies he had not arranged into sentences. He took the seat beside her at the cafe. He watched the cup tremble in her hands and, without grand declarations, placed his own on the table, as if to anchor. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not because the building didn't recognize you. Because I didn't hold my world open enough for you." She had, for years now, accepted these subtle dissonances as part of marriage, an arrangement tie. He would keep the glitter in order. She would keep the home. But the humiliation at the hotel had been different. It had been public. It had been a comment on the life she'd chosen to share with him. "You could have called," she said. "I could have," he admitted. "I could have, and I didn't. But I'm less interested in excuses than in making this right." "Not for me. If you don't want spectacle, I won't make one. But for you." She looked at him, really looked, noting the line at his jaw, the way he watched instinctively for small details, the hand that twitched when he was about to pledge. "How do you make that right?" she asked. Adrian hesitated, then leaned forward as if forming an idea and letting her in. "Not by firing someone because they were thoughtless. Not by token presence. I want to change something real at the Vale Grand. I want it to mean what the name aspires to mean. Hospitality, not hierarchy. If you'll let me, I want to give you a role. Not a show role, but real responsibility. Help me fix what we've allowed to rot under our money." Maya had always preferred to apply her hands to things. Gardens, recipes, words, rather than to titles. Positions, she had noticed, sometimes collected dust. But responsibility without an ego attached sounded different. "You're offering me a job?" she asked, surprised by the clarity of the question. "I'm offering you the chance to run the first weeks of an initiative," he said. "Not to be an ornament, Maya. To listen, to change." She thought of Celeste's smile, the child's laugh, the eyes of the elders watching like jurors. She thought of the quiet staff who knew where the best coffee beans were hidden from the guests and who had recipes written on the backs of uniforms. She thought, too, of the way her own mother had been ushered away from every family celebration because she didn't dress like Asa, and then had made, in the garden at home, a hospitality that outshone all the parties. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll try." They began the work quietly and with care, the way a storm is assembled drop by drop. Adrian did not broadcast that his wife had been slighted and was now doing the correction. He simply cleared his calendar. He allowed Maya to walk the corridors, to sit by service doors, to listen. She met Marco properly, introduced herself to the head chef, to the housekeepers who scrubbed the rugs into surrender, to the bellman who could tell you which rooms had used the soap most generously and which guest had kissed the mirror. The staff reacted to Maya with a mix of surprise and something like relief at last. Someone who did not wear labels but who listened. She asked things that mattered. What made guests feel invaded? What made staff feel invisible? Why one manager's smiles created fear instead of comfort? She discovered that the Vale Grand had become good at the optics of everything while forgetting the practice of kindness. Celeste had been promoted because she excelled at keeping unpleasantness off the record. She had been rewarded for creating an atmosphere of taste and exclusion, for rendering hospitality into a theater of distinctions. The staff had learned to bow to these distinctions or to get very good at small rebellions. Finding ways, in the staff kitchen, to laugh. Maya's initiative was simple and radical. For 2 weeks, the Vale Grand would operate under a new principle. The hotel would not be a stage for the famous or powerful, but a place offering dignity to anyone who entered. They would hold open house evenings, where invitations would be sent to local charities, to neighborhood elders, to people who had never been inside a five-star hotel and who had, in small ways, been taught by their lives not to expect a seat at such a table. The hotel would open a kitchen that offered free meals one night a week to people struggling in the neighborhood and would train staff in listening, not just service. Guests would be made aware that their presence required decency. It was, Adrian knew, a political act. It was also a social experiment, one that might cost him money and certainly would cost some guests their easy assumptions. That was without elaboration. He watched as Maya pulled together staff who believed in the work, summarizing policies with the same clean, domestic logic she used to feed conversations in their kitchen. If you greet someone, you greet them like a human, she told the front desk, not like a role. Not everyone was on board. Celeste saw this as spectacle disguised as morals. She resented the idea of opening the doors to the neighborhood. She feared for the hotel's brand, for what would happen if someone tracked a shoe across the lobby's marble. Celeste's resentment slid into resistance, and then into sabotage. Reservations were mishandled. A list of VIPs was lost. There were whispers. How could a billionaire's wife be allowed to overturn the rules? The whispers made of small cruelties a chorus. The first evening of the open house arrived like a sudden tide. The hotel had been arranged to feel like a place that had always been theirs. Flowers, gathered in mismatched jars, suggested by Maya's touch. Music arranged by a local school's string quartet. The bar had been stocked partly with home-brewed syrups from the neighborhood. Staff wore badges that read "Welcome" in 3 languages. A line formed neighbors, a family with a sleeping toddler, a woman with a violin case and a folder of songs for kids. News vans, expecting a novelty, arrived too. Never fewer than 2 when the Vale name and an odd story came together. In the lobby, Celeste watched from a distance, and her expression was a fortress. An older man, once a limo driver, walked past the chandelier and wept openly at the sight of the view. Someone had, earlier that morning, placed a bouquet on the grand piano with a handwritten note, "For warm nights like this." The staff looked on, unaccustomed to being thanked for simple things. The first real challenge came not from the guests, but from a table of regulars who believed themselves immune to humility. They were society's small gods, women and men who wore names as if jewelry, and they had arrived unplanned to the hotel's lounge. One of them, a man with a laugh like clinking coins, told an assistant loudly that this event was below their usual standards. He turned his nose at a volunteer distributing soup and made a joke the size of a headline. The others laughed in obliging chorus. Maya heard the remark. Instead of responding with anger, she moved to the man's side and sat down without invitation. The room felt oddly like a theater, every head slowly pivoting, like sunflowers to a new sun. "Would you like to try it?" she asked, holding a spoonful of the thick lentil soup. The man blinked, offended that a woman in a tea-stained dress would dare offer him anything. "No, thank you," he said, like a verdict. She shrugged, as if the answer were as trivial as the weather, and took the spoon to her own mouth. A small silence fell at seeing her do something so ordinary. She tasted the soup and closed her eyes briefly, savoring the garlic and cumin and the way salt settled like punctuation. "It's good," she said aloud. And then, because the man was still watching, she offered him a second spoon. "It's warming," she added. "It's from the neighborhood, made by people who are proud." The man, hardened by privilege, scoffed. and called it a publicity stunt. The audience, other guests, staff, volunteers, leaned in. Maya did not wait for permission. She stood and walked to the piano, the man's eyes following her like a child's over a fence. She spoke softly, and the words carried. "We have two things here tonight, neither of which belongs exclusively to anyone. One is a view. This is the Vale Grand's view of the river. Yes, beautiful. The other is what we make with our hands. If you come through our door, you are a guest. That is enough." Her voice held no malice, only an authority formed by years of managing the disorder of real lives. Laundry, heartbreak, healing. People listened. The man, affronted and oddly disarmed, was offered a second serving. He ate like a man picking up a lost habit. When the news vans edited the evening down to sound bites, they recorded Maya's words. The footage spread more quickly than the hotel's planned press release. The taglines varied. Billionaire's wife turns hotel into community haven. But the image they used again and again was of a woman in a linen dress, smiling as a child reached for a pastry with curious, sticky fingers. Celeste's anger thickened into action. That night, she called Adrian and demanded a reversion to hierarchy. "You cannot have your wife decide the running of a flagship property," she said. "It undermines our brand. Our investors will not like it." Adrian listened the way a man listens to a storm's forecast. Calm. Patient. "What we cannot have," he said, "is someone running the place by fear." Celeste's response was a thin laugh. She invoked the shelf life of reputations, the economy of impressions, then used a phrase she'd found useful in the Vale world. "This will reflect badly on you." Adrian thought about reflection. What he had built reflected him in the way glass reflects the weather. He looked at the footage of Maya sitting at tables with volunteers, heard the laughter that had gently replaced the tense ironies, and thought of nothing but the work he wanted to do. "I asked her to help me," he said. "That is my decision. And your name is attached to the estate," Celeste said, as if reminding him of his obligations. "People will not understand. They will be vindictive." He waited. "Then let them be surprised," he said finally. "I will not reduce my wife to a publicist's appendage for prefabricated charity, Celeste. If you cannot do this without making it a spectacle of exclusion, then you and I have different definitions of hospitality." It was a quiet dismissal. One that in Adrian's world meant career earthquake. Celeste would feel tremors in her calendar, in perks withdrawn. She called damage control small and precise. She sent notes to her circle, to the regulars who had clapped their hands at a smile. Some of them wrote up eads about the inauthenticity of wealth. But the river of public opinion had shifted. There is always a moment when an action ceases to be a footnote and becomes a story that changes the rules. The next morning, the hotel woke to a new economy. Some reservations were canceled by people who did not enjoy being surprised by humility. Others increased. Volunteers came to teach a cooking class in the banquet hall. An elderly woman who had worked at a factory 20 years earlier spoke at the podium with a clarity that made tears appear in otherwise dry eyes. Marco, moved and astonished, watched the way staff, maid and maitre d', sus, chef, and bellman, found themselves included in conversations that had previously bypassed them. No one asked for applause, they simply leaned in. The week passed, and then the small revolution solidified into policy. Adrian, who knew how bureaucracy could become a tombstone, made changes with machine, like precision training programs, a listening committee chaired by Maya, a budget for community outreach. He shifted the incentives for management, tethering a portion of bonuses to staff satisfaction and guest feedback, grounded in dignity rather than celebrity presence. His name was in the headlines, yes, but not as the man who had humiliated his wife. Rather as the man who had let his wife change how a major property behaved. Celeste was relieved of her post within a month. The narrative the city likes about such dismissals, greed punished, pressed itself across tabloids. But for Maya, the point was not retribution. She had watched Celeste, once, fold napkins into impossible forms so she could hide how she trembled. When Celeste packed her handbag, Maya approached and offered her a cup of tea. Celeste accepted with a nod that was not humiliation, but the mutual, human fatigue of people who had both worn armor to survive. "You did not have to make an enemy of me," Celeste said, voice small between two empires of feeling. "I did not want an enemy," Maya answered. "I wanted someone who could hold this place tenderly. It appears we both were wearing the wrong masks." Adrian and Maya's marriage changed. It had always been a union formed of commerce and kitchen, of contracts and casseroles. Now the edges were softer. Adrian learned how to hold the gap between his private world and public life. Maya learned how to take up space without guilt. They ate together at the kitchen table in their apartment more often, and Adrian began to ask for stories instead of lists. He began to volunteer, quietly, in the very kitchen he had helped to fund, carrying a crate of vegetables and feeling every one of them. Root, leaf, like a note. Not everyone found such a change simple to swallow. Some guests, wealthy and entitled, found themselves on the outside, turned away politely from rooms that were reserved for too loud parties. A few tried to return with lawyers. Adrian handled the challenges as if arranging a difficult glass of wine. Slow, tasted, decided. The city watched the Vale Grand like a thermometer. When the hotel's lobby filled with neighborhood choirs and the regulars of a Sunday market, when the chandeliers cast light on children's drawings, taped to columns, the building stopped being a rumor and became a place. The final, quiet reckoning came on a rain-heavy Thursday. Celeste, having left and moved back to the edge of the city, wrote an opinion piece about entitlement and taste. It was read by people who liked being validated. But the piece also attracted contributors from the staff who wrote back, not in rage but in memory. There were tributes to small kindnesses given in the dark and the names of housekeepers whose heads had held stories that should have been told. The comments under the article were a constellation of real lives. Someone from the social circle that had once laughed at Maya's linen dress came to the Vale Grand for a private meeting. She was someone who had been turned away in those first weeks, whose pride had been wounded. She had arrived intending to use threats, to find leverage in the empire's soft places. But she left on the train with a box of pastries and an apology she did not expect to feel. The story that had started with the jolt of denial ended with an accumulation of small corrections. People felt the change not because they had been punished, but because the world was taught, gently and repeatedly, that dignity was not a commodity. It re-entered the architecture of the building like a scent, impossible to trace to one hand. And yet the day the city learned that the Vale Grand had been placed into a new trust with a community advisory board and naming rights that paid staff for life. Well, that was news. Adrian had never been one for grand gestures, yet he wanted an institution that could outlive whims. He had sat in his office, counting numbers like a man who feared ruin, and then had chosen to mortgage the vanity of his holdings in exchange for a legacy that, he believed at last, might mean something that would not be used by someone else for a headline. The lawyers called it a restructuring. The community called it a promise. When the trustees met to sign, Maya stood with the pen in her hand. It was a small pen. She had insisted on something sensible. For a moment, the room felt thin as paper. The hand that took it was steady, the signature crisp and clear. There were cameras, yes, but the truth of the room was in the faces. Staff who had held their children through nights of impossible shifts, volunteers who had fed elders who thought the city had forgotten them, neighbors who had, before the Vale Grand's doors were finally pried open, felt an ache they could not name. On the way home that evening, Adrian and Maya walked without being attended, letting rain interfere with their clothes. The street smelled of hot tar and jasmine someone had planted in a crack. A child who lived in the block they crossed tugged on Maya's sleeve and asked if she would teach him to make the pastry he had tasted, the one with sugar spilled like small stars. She crouched and showed him how to fold, how to be patient with dough. Adrian watched, a smile like a private son. "You could have made them regret it in 100 other ways," he said later, his voice soft in the car. "I could have made them apologize." Maya thought of Celeste's smile, the man's laugh, the way power sometimes used hunger as entertainment. "Did you want them to regret it?" she asked. He was quiet. The question had the weight of truth. "I wanted them to have to look at the fact that they had been unkind. I wanted them to notice it. Regret is a start, but noticing can become something else. I wanted them to be asked to do better, not be humiliated." When she looked at him, she saw a man whose life was measured with numbers and whose heart, once used like currency, was learning to be held like an object of fragile beauty. "Ed, are you?" she asked. He laughed, a small, imperfect sound. "I think of you when I make decisions now. That is something." A week later, Celeste's name appeared in the city paper again, not as a wounded queen, but as a woman who had enrolled in a hospitality program to learn how to run a small bed and breakfast in the hills. There were pictures of her carrying a crate of eucalyptus, and in one, a slight, genuine smile. The headline read Reinvention. It left space for complexity. The Vale Grand remained a building of glass and marble, but it ceased to be only a mirror for the powerful. It became, under a woman who liked jam, stained hymns, and a man who could imagine his buildings as lungs, something that breathed. People who once believed their role in the world was to be seen learned instead to see. People who had been invisible found that their everyday work mattered enough to anchor a hotel in an ethic. Years later, when little plaques dotted the walls, names of staff who had saved the hotel from small catastrophes, the neighborhood choir memorialized for a particular winter when pipes froze. The story of the London dress was told without rancor. Maya, looking out over the river from a balcony she had cleaned more than once in her life, would sometimes remember the child's laugh at the hotel's doors the morning she was denied. She would remember the weight of that refusal, the way it had felt like a closed hand. And then she would look at the life around her, a hotel that served soup and music, and, sometimes, the chance to cross a threshold into a world that had previously kept its doorways fenced. The regret, when it came, was not an explosive thing. It arrived in quiet returns, a donation, a hand extended across a banquet table, a pause before a word that might wound. Those who had laughed learned a reverse craft, how to be surprised by the decency that had always been possible. They learned the long lesson that making someone regret is less valuable than teaching someone to be better. At evening, Adrian would sometimes walk into the kitchen unannounced and listen. He would watch as Maya joked with a line cook about the exactness of salt, or as she taught a boy to braid dough until his arms ached. He had, over 10 years, built a life of sharp edges and brilliant facades. In the soft, domestic centers, he had learned the better currency to wait, to listen, to make a regret into a chance. On rainy days, when clouds turned the river to pewter, the Vale Grand lights came on like an old friend recalled. People filtered through its doors. Neighbors, guests, the occasional socialite who had learned, much later than the rest, that the richest rooms were not the ones lined with silk, but the ones lined with people who remembered how to belong. And sometimes, when a woman in a simple dress passed the front desk, the new concierge, trained in a philosophy Maya had helped write, would smile and say, as if it were the most important question in the world, "Welcome home."